I wondered if you could talk about the way in which a teacher outdoes a student. And I guess what it might look like if a person is sufficiently emptied, or a student is sufficiently emptied, if that's possible.
Abhi asked a question in class, I think it was Thursday, about innocence. I don't remember the story that Nietzsche had wrote some years ago, so I'm just gonna wing it. I know you know the story much better than I, so forgive me if I make a lot of blunders here and there. So I suppose the story is that, you're born and there is this innocence that you have which slowly gets taken away from you. For all the right reasons, of course. I suppose this innocence, in the Gurdjieffian sense, it would be your essence. And in your innocence and in your essence, there is no shame, there is no guilt. And everything is so organic. You cry for the right reasons and you scream for the right reasons. And your imagination is so fertile, that you don't need anything to distract you. You can just look up there to your sides and you can just entertain yourself for an hour. There is such independence, I mean, it's all stemming from naivete, that it's just what infants do without really knowing what they do. Then socialization and enculturation begins, your parents and their notions of do's and don'ts. You open the front door as we did, and you see your friends having bicycles, but you don't. You go to other streets, it's paved, but ours is just dirt. And I remember we didn't have a TV, but one of our friends did. And one day he said, let's go to my house and we can watch, this cartoon. We said, okay. It was Aquaman. It had just come from America to Iran. And it was such a fantastic, 20-minute cartoon show. And then I remember going home asking my father if we're going to get a TV. It wasn't so much about playing soccer in the streets anymore, but... And then my brother was very studious, very disciplined, very responsible. I was just aloof. And so they made me feel bad for the sort of person that I was. And it did impact me, I always compared myself to my brother and how sufficient he was and how proficient he was in so many things. And then you go to school and you get like an F on your essay, and you go to these wastelands, where we used to live in Iran, and you grab a red pen and you try to make the F into a B, so when you go home and you show it to your parents, instead of them slapping you because you failed, a class or an essay, they would give you some cookies because it wasn't an F. You surprise them with a B, but they would usually find out. And so little by little your innocence goes away, Everything has a proper place. Everything you say must be in a certain way. And so you become, as Nietzsche would say, you become a camel. You just your parents put things on you, and that's your burden. Then you have friends, and without really knowing, you compete with them, and that burdens you. You go to school, and that burdens you. You change physically and hormonally, and that's another burden. There is so much that, you and I carry. And I don't know what happens to our innocence or our soul or our essence, but they just get covered up little by little without really us knowing. But then there are these moments, where you just kind of wake up depressed, and I don't know how it happens, or you watch a sad movie, and even though your life is filled with privilege, you want to make sense of all the things that you have, and it doesn't make any sense. You just kind of look at everything as a waste. And really, for that particular moment, you kind of live the Socratic motto that the unexamined life is not worth living. That you really, in that moment, you examine everything, your relationships, and what you're doing with yourself, what you're doing with your time, with your youth, and that's all you can do. You can examine it, and upon examining things, everything falls apart, but you can't fill it with anything. You just don't have the tools. You don't even know what you're looking for. All you know is that, if kids have a sense of awe and wonder, but they exercise it without any loss, as adults, the moment you exercise awe and wonder, all rooted in that particular moment of innocence, where you have no shame in asking questions. You have no shame in really just intellectually and emotionally being naked and going to your husband or going to your wife or going to your friends or raising your hand in a classroom and asking the most innocent of questions like, what are we doing here? You know, like, why are we married? Why did we have kids? I'm really an awful parent, you know. And you're not doing it in a mean-spirited way. It's just a moment of emptiness where innocence comes up and, you know, you just ask questions. But it's too much. It's too much. Your companion assumes that just because you're asking, it means that you want to leave them. Your kids imagine that you don't love them, you know. If, I suppose, there's a God, and if you were to knock on his door and say, do you really exist? God would probably assume that you have lost your faith. And maybe you have for a couple of minutes, but, you know, as adults, when you ask those questions, you lose everything that you had built for yourself up to that point, and it's devastating. And so there is, I think, something about our organism. If you ask these questions in an untimely way, you know, it kind of shuts down and forces you to forget, or at least become slowly numb. You know, and then you are kind of embarrassed or ashamed because you asked your companion a question that was rooted in really honesty, sincerity, innocence. Well, you bow your head, you go to them and you say, I'm really sorry, I didn't really mean anything by it. And then you just cover yourself up. You know, but these moments usually happen in life by life. Sometimes your own psyche just empties itself for a few minutes. But for the most part, you go back to being who we've always been. You're just a camel. And there is nothing wrong with carrying other people's nonsense, societies, culture, religion, all the teachers out there. Because it is valuable to conform. It is valuable to follow. You know, it's like your GPS to life. Just doing things on your own is way, way, way too difficult. You know, so you kind of just build on what others have done in the past. You know, I don't want to go into a cave to figure out who I am, what I am. I just read the Quran, I have faith in Muhammad or the Buddha or Jesus, and I say, okay, well, what they said must have been true or must be accurate or whatever, and I become a Christian or a Muslim and I go to a church or a mosque. Then, you know, something happens, I think. There has to be something, and I think it's for the most part invisible. I don't want to sound hippie-ish, but it's like this back and forth energy that takes place with when someone who has something and someone who is seeking something. And I don't know what it is. I mean, different traditions call it different things. You know, it's like if I was to go to Hinduism, it's like there is this coiled up energy in your Kundalini center, you know. It's psychic, it's filled with tension and conflict. And upon meeting someone, you know, it kind of just comes to life like a serpent that just rises up. at a certain point, this camel who has been conditioned to carry a culture that's many thousands of years old, a religion that's many thousand years old, social rituals and etiquettes that's hundreds if not thousands of years old, that all of them live inside us. I mean, I remember one day I was so frustrated with all of this stuff, and it was Ramadan, the fasting month, that I just sat in the Quran. I put my behind in the Quran, and my mom screamed and my dad yelled. Because for them the Quran made sense. For them the fasting month made sense, Ramadan. For them the Quran was not just, ink on paper, it was a sacred text. For me, it meant nothing. It couldn't offer me anything, And I desperately wanted something to give me meaning, but nothing would. And, I look at this book and I say, they say it's sacred. They say it was, revelations given to Muhammad by God. And yet it does nothing for me. And so at a certain point, I suppose, you as a camel kind of look at all the things you've been carrying for all these years. And you say, you know what, I'm just going to bend my knees. And I'm going to sit. And I'm going to wiggle a little. And I'm going to throw all these bags on the ground. And I'm going to stand up and I'm going to walk naked, walk free. So, whenever you encounter someone with whom you have a connection, and I'm not talking about like a romantic kind, I'm talking about for some strange reason, you just feel someone's presence without them opening their mouth to say a couple of things, or you actually do hear them talk and something about you moves. I was in San Francisco many, many years ago. There was a Persian movie that had come in Japantown, and I remember going up the escalator, and I looked down, and there's this man. I'd never seen him. I didn't know who he was. But I felt as if I knew him. I bowed my head and nodded my head, and he did the same thing. So I went down the escalator, I went to him. We both kissed on the cheek, and then we both kissed on the forehead. We shook hands, embraced, and we parted ways. And I suppose because he kind of just looked a few years older than I was, I didn't give him much value, in the sense that I didn't want to ask him who he was, what he was, if he was a teacher of sorts. I just enjoyed the experience, and this was way past, my encounter with Hussein and Haqqi. So I didn't really have the desire to kind of just talk to anyone, or follow anyone, or be guided or taught by anyone. By then I had gained a bit more autonomy. So, before you can actually become a student to anyone, I think there is a place in us that longs for something, and I don't know what that is. I think if Hafiz is right, that human beings are like tulips, and right at the very center of their being, it's something dark. It's a dark spot. And for Hafiz, it's right at the very center of your heart, because God placed his finger on it and burned it and said, nothing in the physical world will ever satisfy you, because through my finger I have burnt your heart, so that you could always have this longing, and this longing can only be satisfied by me and through me, And so I suppose it's a nice, creative, poetic way of describing the kind of difficulty that we as human beings have, that at a certain point you realize everything you have done in your life is not enough and you want more, but you just don't know what it is. Okay. Now, all you have is moments of intimations that something about you is just off, you know, and it doesn't really matter how accomplished you are in your physical life. So up to this point, you're just a regular human being, like a camel. You walk around, you carry all the things that others have placed on you, including culture and society and your parents and those other folks. And once in a while you have mood swings where nothing makes any sense. But you're not a student. You're just, someone who has once in a while an opening, sees something, you realize it's far too burdensome, and you don't really know how to keep that spark alive that tells you that, you're a complete waste of a life. So having that, and all the things that are placed on you is what we call personality, something that Irina Tweedy just talked about. That here you have your essence or your soul, and here you have, after all these years of living in society and having all these desires and being in environments where things are just being advertised to your senses, little by little the essence gets covered up, and then you have a name, Amir Sabzvari, and then you ridiculously give yourself a title, I'm a professor of philosophy. And then you read all this nonsensical books and all these ideas get in your head. And the assumption is, just because I have some ideas, just because I think some thoughts, these ideas are mine and I actually do understand them. And then you have your own pathetic little life experiences, which just gets your personality even thicker. And we are immensely cunning animals in the sense that even though we function mainly through all the masks that we wear, unknowingly for the most part, we assume that these masks are really our souls, that our poetry comes from our soul, that our talks, whatever they may be, they also are generated from our souls. In other words, we are created because our soul is alive, But these are just the bags that have been put on us. And I think we're just desperate for a part of us to kind of come to life and, And so all human beings have the potential to become a student. But all human beings come with all sorts of bags on them, despite having potentials, despite having moments of emptiness and innocence and sincerity. We all get covered up. So sometimes your encounter with a teacher who is going to, I suppose, train you on the spiritual quest. Sometimes it could be immediate, sometimes it could be gradual. The problem with this immediate sense of attraction to a teacher, what it fails to do for you, I think sometimes, is it fails to generate doubt. Because you need doubt, you need the conflict. You need to go to the teacher, stay with him or her, and then leave. go back to life. And in that way, you are tested. Life tests you. Your teacher tests you. And you kind of understand the worth of your own salt, Unless you happen just to be at the right place in life where you meet someone and within like an hour or two or a week you just recognize that they are in fact the person that you're supposed to be with. They have things to teach you. And it's what happened with Hussein and Hussein, the two Husseins, that it was just the second or the third or the fourth meeting that he just heard this noise inside his head, follow this man. He didn't need the doubts, he was already like a 40-year-old man whose life his physical life was just very chaotic, And that's another factor, if your life is full and it's rich and you're content, you're going to be far more attached to your physical life. You're going to be attached to your companion. You're going to be attached to your kids. You're going to be attached to your job, all the psychological narratives. If on the other hand your life is chaotic, things about you are broken already, and you just want someone to kind of give meaning to that brokenness. Life has nothing to offer you. Every time you go home, you have a disagreement that turns into like a screaming fight with your companion. And then your entire life is under an avalanche of questions, and you want to leave your life, but you can't. And so you're just ready for someone to come into your life and say, your life sucks, but I can offer you a different life, but you don't really need to leave the life that you have created thus far. If you have a life that is, again, a life that you're comfortable with, it's going to be really, really, really difficult. Because if your life is broken, the sort of guilt you're going to feel is not going to be as intense. If on the other hand you have a good marriage or your life is relatively healthy and comfortable, every time you want to walk away from your life, you have to figure out what you're going to tell your companion. You got to figure out what to tell your kids. You have to figure out what to do with God, what you're going to tell God, what you're going to tell your parents, what you're going to tell yourself. So the amount of guilt and shame and resistance and conflict that's going to be inside you is just tremendous, Now, one of the ways that a person who has a relatively rich life, comfortable life, can little by little find him or herself okay with walking away is دزدیده چون جان میروی اندر میان جان من. Your life is good, but the teacher you've encountered is like a thief at night. You're not even aware, but little by little, just the way they sit, the way they eat, the way they talk, their body language, it just goes inside you. And the more interaction you have with this person, you realize that they occupy more and more space. So then, besides the immediate attraction, there is the gradual attraction, which is, you encounter someone, they're okay. You don't really find them that interesting initially. And little by little, sometimes it takes 5 months, sometimes it takes 2 years. But something about you, forces you to keep in touch with this person. And one morning you realize that, just because you go to his or her gatherings, it doesn't mean you're going to accept everything that this person says. You're probably going to take in 5% of everything and you're going to say 95% is just junk, you know, because there is no like relationship. And if you don't have a relationship, you don't really respect. You know, sometimes you can respect someone without loving them, and sometimes you respect them because you love them, but you're not there yet. All you know is that, you know, this person has some interesting things to say. Now, whenever you encounter students, what usually you encounter is most of who and what they are has roots in their physical life experiences. Okay. The problem with spiritual teachers is that the spirit has a tendency of rejecting everything that's physical. You know, that you can be married to your wife and you can be married to your husband, but you must also be married to your teacher, and that marriage is going to have a different quality. You know, you're going to have conversations with your friends, but your conversation with your teacher is going to be very, very different. And part of the difficulty is that, and that also depends on the teacher, that who he or she is, what he or she is advertising, how potent those pieces of advertisements are. Before the teacher has any power to empty you of all the things you've accumulated over the past many, many years, what you need to understand, Cassie, is as the sort of camels that we are, your marriage allows you to assume the identity of a wife. That's meaningful, you know. That you're a professor, that's also meaningful. You're a mother, you're a daughter, you're a friend. And these are just ropes we hang on to because they do give us identity and meaning and value, you know. Add to it the fact that life is burdensome. And from the moment you wake up, you try to wrestle with all the problems that life throws at you. And so, inasmuch as I suppose none of us may desire some of the things that exist in our physical life, the truth is most of the emotions that live inside us, mostly negative, they are rooted in the physical everyday experience. Most of our angers and disappointments and hopes and dreams have to do with our physical body in the midst of a physical world. And so, if you have a very intense relationship with your physical life, and there is nothing wrong with that, you know, the longing that lives inside your essence is always there. Once in a while it just pushes its head, you know, out of your physical life and says, you have forgotten me, I'm just here to remind you. And then it goes back down, making you feel guilty for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. If you have a teacher like Moses, he's going to have you fight for those who don't have much. You know, someone like a Moses is not going to invite you to find the kingdom of God within. You know, if that is the spiritual quest you're looking for, Moses is not about that. Moses is about social justice and fairness. Moses is about removing slavery, you know, making sure that society doesn't hold anyone hostage for any wrong reasons. So Moses connects you back to your physical life, you know. Jesus, on the other hand, he does something. I mean, people like Jesus who don't have a house, who don't have mortgages, who don't have a wife, who don't have kids, who after 18 long years of not being around, all of a sudden appear, don't even go to their mother and say, hello, I'm your son, nothing. And if the gospel story is right, that even on the cross he looks at his mom and says, woman, not even mom, not even I'm sorry for being such a crummy son. He just says, woman, behold your son. And, John is standing next to her. If you're talking about someone who's very, very, very detached from life, what you have are two different teachers with two very, very different sets of advertisements. And they demand different things from you. Moses would say, don't lie to your parents and to your husband and to your neighbor. Jesus demands that you don't lie to yourself. And these are very, very, very different things. Not to lie to yourself, you have to get to know yourself really, really well. And it's really dark in there. Moses, on the other hand, in as much as it's also difficult, it's much easier path to follow. So, what all of us have in life is assumptions, attachments, emotions, all connected to our physical life. And now you say, how does a teacher empty the student? Sometimes when Yusuf asks me for a spoon, I give him mine. He looks at the spoon and says, no, you've touched it already. I want a clean spoon. At this stage of my understanding Cassie, and I don't understand things very well, but in as much as I can, I think teachers are extremely, extremely, extremely selfish. I think whenever you want to establish a relationship with anyone, the assumption is that you have something to give. Whether we're talking about a romantic relationship. Yesterday was our New Year, or a couple of days ago. And my mom had invited this person. And in the 2, 3, 4 hours that we were there, he was trying to dominate the conversation, which was okay. He was like an 80-year-old man. There was something about him that screamed, I think I know what I'm talking about. And I look at the rest of you and I categorize all of you as idiots. Listen to me. Given that we're all selfish and teachers are no exempt from this, and given that teachers don't really enjoy when their ideas are someone gives a commentary about what they're saying, you know. I remember Jacob Needleman some years ago when I had some conversations with him at his house. He had just finished this book called The Heart of Philosophy. Not a very good book, but you know, as books go, it's relatively a good book. He had written this chapter in the book, and one of his friends was there. And so he said, you know, I had spent like 5-6 months writing this chapter. So what do you think, Joe? And Joe looks at, you know, Jacob Needleman and says, well, let me tell it to you in about 5 minutes what he just said. You know? And Needleman kind of had this grin on his face. And he said, yeah, I guess that's accurate, you know. And here you have 6 months of a man's life reduced to 5 minutes, you know. And the heartache is not seen, you know. All the reflections and ideas are like puzzles, and then when you put them on a piece of paper, it becomes even more difficult. So, since teachers are selfish and they want to inject their ideas and their feelings and their task in life into the student, and the student comes with a history, what you have is, initially at least, there's going to be resistance from the student. And a good teacher with a good amount of experience that have been processed well, they're not going to be like an Eckhart Tolle, where they say, well, every perspective is right, you know, and they're calm and serene and soft-spoken. They're just going to tell the student that the student is wrong. I mean, they're intellectually going to punish them. Whether or not the student returns, no one knows. If the interaction continues, there is a part inside the student that opens up to the teacher. In other words, and that part that opens up, it houses the presence of the teacher. And you have to wait and wait and wait and wait for, I suppose, the king of all emotions, which is called love. One of the things that love does, and it's not just the student loving the teacher, it's also the teacher loving the student. It's a two-way street, because if you love your teacher but the teacher doesn't love you back, then you're not going to get very far. If the teacher loves the student but the student doesn't love back, that's not going to go very far either. Okay? So it has to go both ways. Initially, what's going to happen is the teacher is going to love the student more than the student can realize. Okay? And it's not because, and it's only because the student has allowed certain parts of him or herself to be possessed by the teacher. And the teacher can see his or her own reflection inside the student. Okay? And it's not because the student understands the teacher. And the teacher doesn't really care how well the student understands, because we're not talking about an intellectual relationship. We're talking about a relationship that is really, for the most part, revolves around emotions. The intellectual relationship happens to students when the student leaves the teacher, where you go away and, you know, like a nice honeybee, you sit somewhere and 20, 30, 40 years of your time with your teacher, you sit, and then you begin to think thoughts Then you begin to reflect. Then you begin to make sense of all the things that he or she has said to you, all of your experiences. And then you digest what you can. And that becomes your own wisdom and your own interpretation. And then you reject the rest. Or the rest doesn't even matter anymore. Okay? So if there is no emotions between the student and the teacher, it won't go very far. It's impossible. Now, with your friends, you can go to places. With your friends, you can go to coffee shops, you can sit and watch TV, you can do all sorts of things. In other words, your friends can connect you back to the physical world. With the teacher, there is nothing that you can do. What you have is just a bundle of intense feelings coming at you from all over the place, And all you do with the teacher, you just sit and you just talk. Or you just sit and don't talk. And the only way that can happen is initially you are passive to your soul and very active to your personality. It's your personality that's in the driver's seat. What the teacher does is he or she makes your personality, the desires that live inside you, the unspiritual, physical desires. The teacher has to pacify those desires and so activate your essence or your soul. Not your reflection, just the emotions, okay? And not the emotions that connect you or have to do with your physical life. It's a set of emotions that have nothing to do with your physical life. And that's where the conflict appears. And it's going to be really, really intense. The more you like your teacher, the more intense it's going to be. And as personality becomes pacified, your essence, your soul becomes activated. And you go back into your physical life, but it doesn't have the power to touch you. And it feels as if you are in life, but you're not part of any aspect of life. Okay? Now, it's impossible to be empty without, I'm not talking about depression just yet. Okay? There comes a point where you fall in love with your teacher, but you have no idea what exactly you're falling in love with. Are you in love with his or her physical space, physical body, his or her eyes, lips, nose, whatever, the room, Are you in love with his or her soul, if there is such a thing? So it's really quite a kind of a mysterious thing. And your intellect comes down to figure this out, but you can't figure it out. Now, here's the difficulty, Cassie. Before you can sit in your room and knock on the gates of divinity, the truth is, the initial steps are that you find yourself outside of your teacher's home and you keep banging on his or her door because your teacher, the physical person, is the extension of the thing you're looking for, which you don't really know what it is. It's kind of like the Gospel of John, where you see me, you see God, I can't access beauty. I don't know what it is, but I watch this 20-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo play soccer, and it's amazing. It really, really is. You know, I'm just consumed and everything else disappears in my life. You know, he just captures me for like 5, 10, 20 minutes before Yusuf just barges in. One of the things that I think happens in the presence of a teacher is this is after like you have emotionally fallen into this trap. I'm not talking about going there and having an intellectual conversation. There is really nothing to talk about. There are no questions to ask. All I want to do is just be there. I want to look at him or her. My own experience was that I was both full and empty when I went to Hussein's house. And when I left his house, I was both full and empty. But I couldn't find a place for myself in life, you know. And because I don't think teachers enjoy having competition, naturally and organically they have this thing inside them called jealousy. You can't, you know, I remember a couple of times I made the mistake of talking about Descartes or talking about some of the Sufi saints in front of Hussein. And I even remember one time telling him that I was working with Jacob Needleman some exercises, and I unknowingly told Hussein some of those things. And Hussein looks at me and says, I've known this for many, 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 many years. And the truth is, he didn't. But he didn't enjoy me talking about Jacob Needleman. I remember even I had pictures of David Long at the car wash. And one day he comes to the car wash and says, oh, is that David Long? You framed his photo? I said, yeah. And he shook his head but didn't say anything, you know. Because the truth is, he wanted all of my intellectual space and he wanted all of my emotional space. He wanted me all to himself. And I think all teachers desire that. It's no different really than any romantic love relationship. So, I suppose the short answer, and forgive me for rambling on, you're full of life, whether it's immediate or gradual, you fall in love, conflict begins to appear. Little by little, the object of love just grows inside you as the days go by, to the point that everything inside you is the thing you have fallen in love with. And love by its very nature pacifies you. It makes you wait, be patient. You know, صد فصل بهار آید و بیرون ننهم گام ترسم که بیایی تو و در خانه نباشم. I shall sit in my room, you know, the entire year. Fall comes, then spring comes, then summer comes, and winter comes. I will never leave my room because I'm waiting for this knock on the door. love forces you to submit. There isn't much you can do. You know. You know, in romantic relationships, it eventually just fizzles out and you walk away. I can't say I fell in love with Hussein's soul. I don't really know what that means. All I know is that there was something about him that I really, really, really enjoyed. And it was something I was telling Sarah this morning. Because we talked about Hussein during the New Year. You know, that very much like you, Cassie. I was 18. I mean, you were younger than I, you know. I wanted to play tennis, or play soccer, be a musician. It all went away. I was a confused kid. Then I became a more confused kid, encountering Hussein and all the things he would say and I didn't understand. You know. When your individuality goes away, your self goes away, I remember one day I went home and I threw away all of my music and I just picked up traditional music. You know. The problem with sometimes you love something, but you don't yet have it, you just love it. Sometimes you love something and you have it, and then you explore it, and then your love becomes mature in understanding as well, you know. The problem with loving something but not yet having it is that there is so much longing and yearning that lives inside you. And there is like this empty space and nothing can fill it. And you live in anguish and you live in pain. And everything about life just tastes bitter. It's just poison, you know. And that's the difficulty of this particular stage in love. That you have someone like Hussein, you see him every day, you enjoy what he says, you enjoy the way he makes you feel about yourself, and you enjoy the way he makes you feel about him, you enjoy the conversation. Everything is beautiful. The only problem is you have a lot of feelings, you just don't understand what these feelings are about, you know. And so you pray, but you have no idea what you're praying to. You fast, but you have no idea why you're fasting. You do all these ridiculous things. And when you laugh, you feel guilty. When you go out on a date, you feel bad because you feel as if you're betraying not just Hussein, you're betraying this passion you have for something. If you are lucky, you know, if any student is lucky, there comes a point where little by little understanding will come, you know. And that's the thing. You need to understand something really, really well and then express it. It's the only way you can find rest, you know. I suppose you could call it closure. But generally speaking, today because we knew that all of you were going to come here, we got back around midnight last night, and we woke up around 6, and we started cleaning the house, you know. You woke up at 8, that's right, Paul. Lazy bum. And so, you know, inside a student, there is so much history. And the only thing that a teacher can do for the first, I suppose, many months, if not years, is to just get some sort of a vacuum and, you know, get rid of all the stuff that lives inside the student. And I think the easiest vacuum available that can kind of make this journey a bit more faster, you know, is just fall in love. Everything else disappears. It's an agonizing place for the student, you know. And some students eventually become like, you know, Aesop's fable, the sour grape. You know, if you have seen that movie, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where it's night, and I think her name is Jane Fox, who had killed, you know, the teacher. And I forget the guy's name who is the hero of the movie. Where the woman looks at this guy and says, you know, your teacher had no problem sleeping with me or having sex with me, but he never gave me the secrets of Wudon. And that's the thing, you know, where the student really needs to just be patient for a long time. Be okay with all the so-called abuse and trust. And it's very difficult, you know. I remember I had told my grandfather and my uncle to send me some books from Iran, and eventually they arrived. It took like 4 months for them to get here. And I look at them and I say, this does not make any sense. It's like classical Persian. And lots of like Arabic words and concepts, and I didn't understand. And I said, I'm not going to waste my life, you know, trying to figure this out. So I called Hussein and said, Hussein, you know, I got these books, and can I bring them by and show them to you? And my intention wasn't really to sell them to him or give them to him. I just wanted to figure out what to do with them, how to read them and understand them. And he looks at me and says, they're not good for you. Give them to me. And he said, I'll buy them from you. What can you say? I mean, I'm not going to say no. So I said, okay, you know. And then he says, okay. So he goes to behind the counter and he gives me 2 pounds of Bulgarian cheese, feta cheese. He says, this is your payment. And I say to him, I said, what the hell? You know, I am so upset. And, you know, after like an hour, I get back into my car and I'm using all these profanities. I'm screaming. You know, these are like books that you can't find. They're no longer printed. You know, my grandfather and my uncle had to go to these like secret places to get these books. And I just gave them away for 2 pounds of cheese. And I didn't have the courage to say, God damn it, give me my books back and shove this cheese, you know, back into the counter. You know, it took me, I can't tell you, it took me so many years. Because then we would have gatherings. I would go to his house and I would see my books right there. And I can't tell you how often I was tempted to just kind of grab them, while he was like looking away, put them in my bag, or, run the books to the car. I felt betrayed in so many ways and exploited. And I guess I could say I didn't love enough and have faith enough, trusted enough. But eventually I understood. And I'm glad that I kept my mouth shut. The best analogy I can use, and perhaps I should have done this from the beginning to save, all of you from a headache. Students are like a dirty house. They really are. I mean, it's like an unkept house for like years. They think about the wrong things. They have wrong interpretation of things that give them the wrong experiences, wrong emotions. They have unprocessed history. And what little has been processed is like giving birth to indigestion. It's just, everything about them is just awful. It really, really is. Mahin, you met Mahin, Sayyid's sister. She studied sitar with Zulfunun here in San Jose. And then her job was in Washington. And in Washington lived this tar and sitar player, Muhammad Reza Lutfi, the best sitar player like up to 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And he wouldn't accept the students unless they came with a formal letter from a teacher that he knew. So she goes to Zulfun and says, I have to relocate. I have to go to Washington, and there is Muhammad Reza Lutfi. Can you write me a letter that I was your student for all these years? Yeah. So he goes, or she goes, and says, I'm here to learn from you. And you know what Lutfi says to her? I need to watch you play for half an hour. She says, okay. And so she starts playing the sitar. And all the while, she told me, like years later, that Lutfi was just shaking his head, very disappointingly. And he says to her that you have to forget everything that you have learned, which means that every teacher has their own way of teaching. That if you have worked with Mr. X, if you go to Mr. Y, everything you have learned from your previous teacher, all the habits, all the addictions, all the emotions, all the history, you have to get rid of them. And Mahin said, for the first year, I just had to forget all the things that my teacher, and Zulfunun was great. I mean, he was perhaps number 3 sitar player in Iran, And so that's how students are. They come to you filled with just junk, but they're interested. But you can't give them anything except to get rid of the stuff that lives inside them. And that's going to be painful because they are their history. They are the camel we talked about, But it doesn't even end there, because even after you fall in love, even after you have a good amount of understanding, students at a certain point, they become so boastful, so proud, so arrogant. And it's like anything else in life. You have money, you become arrogant. You push people around, you bully people around. And there comes a point that your understanding has matured just a little. But as your understanding has matured, so has your arrogance. It goes up. You know, as you get closer to God, you also get closer to the devil, you know. And so something about you must come to recognize. I mean, at different stages, you become full and empty of certain things, you know. I remember I was at Laney, I had given my couple of my classes to a couple of my students to teach for a day or two. And once in a while I would sit and just watch them teach. They were inspired. But their arrogance, Cassie, you know, how they would scream and shout in the class and how they would present themselves. False modesty and false humility. You know, I think this book, Daughter of Fire, is really a great expression of someone who thinks that she knows. She has all these ideas about what a teacher looks like and how he or she should speak. And what you encounter for the better half of the book is you just have a very stupid and shallow woman, you know, who tries but fails and tries and fails and tries and fails. And there are moments where things click, you know. You see this here? It takes 2 hours of screaming for 30 seconds of music. You know, things he just doesn't want to do. He's full of not wanting to do certain things. And so somehow you have to empty him of all the things he doesn't want to do and create in him a desire. And you have to manipulate. I'll give you Coke, I'll buy you Sprite, I'll take you to Sam's Club, you know. Yeah, that's how Surush was. And now when Surush wants to play the piano, he does it loud, obnoxiously. No one wants to hear him. Obnoxious. I'm sorry, Cassie, I just talked about nothing. Yusuf really loves Cristiano Ronaldo. Even, I don't know why he likes him. Maybe he's a good-looking man, maybe it's just the way he hits the ball, maybe it's the way he runs. But You know, when he goes on the internet, there are all sorts of things he can watch, all sorts of games he can play. But no, he's like empty of all of that, and he only hangs on to Cristiano. But there has to be a mutual attraction between two people. Kendra, anything?
I was wondering if you could talk about the last line, that we are both the pilgrim and the way.
Pilgrim and the way. I know you have read Attar's Mantawatir, the birds. You know. So a pilgrim is just a seeker of sorts. So that's what a pilgrim is. But we don't usually consider someone who's going to a Beyonce concert a pilgrim. You say, oh, some guy is going to, a concert. A pilgrim has it has a sacred connotation, that there is a goal. That goal happens to be very profound, very holy, very religious, very spiritual. There is something sacred about that particular path, or where this person is going. And it goes back to, Cassie's question, that a pilgrim is a student. Okay? And despite all the things I just said, I don't really know how students are created. All I know is that for the longest time we show a good amount of interest. But to become good at anything, there comes a point where you just don't feel like playing the piano, but you have to. There are pieces you play that you can't feel them, but you have to. Your fingers need to stretch and it's painful and you don't want to do it, but you have to. So being a student means about 80-90% of what you do is uncomfortable. It's not filled with passion. You don't feel positive emotions, but they're mostly negative. One of the reasons I didn't become really a good student when it comes to music or anything was that I wanted to feel. I didn't want to read notes. I didn't want to understand the notes. I didn't want to understand how notes apply to daf or tombak or tambour or sitar. I just wanted to play and feel, And the feelings became the biggest obstacle. It's something that Hussein always told me. When we went to gatherings, he said, Amir, go dance. I said, no, Hussein, I don't know how to dance, and all these people, I don't want to dance, I'm too shy. And he would always say, you will never amount to anything useful, And I remember all the interviews I went to, and how shy and how reserved, how incompetent I was. Because I didn't want other people to judge me. I was very aware of how they would look at me and how they would see me and how they would judge me, and I wouldn't want that to happen to me. So staying in a corner, you're invisible. Center stage, they look at you. And when they realize that your body moves like a 2x4, they laugh at you. And that hurts you, pains you, you know. And had I listened to Hussein, had I made myself uncomfortable in gatherings, doing things that I wasn't very good at, what would happen eventually, I would say, you know, I don't really care. I'm not here to please the audience. I'm only here to please Hussein. That's the only person who matters. But I wasn't able to give up that part of myself. And so, which forced me to go to interviews and be awful at them. They ask me a question, I give like a 10-second answer, and then I put my head down and I leave the room because I was so bad, you know. So, you don't become a student while you have passion. You become a student when there is no passion, but you have understood the importance of the craft and how valuable it is, that you say, you know what, I am going to do this. I don't like to, but I will. I mean, I wake up and I go to the office, and 90% of my time there is not spent in writing. But I force myself to just write a line, and it takes me like 5 hours to write a tiny little paragraph. And sometimes I say, you know what, why do I come here at all? I come here because I'm hoping, you know, that maybe today I can make enough effort and struggle enough and experience enough pain so that I can generate a good paragraph, and it's worth it, you know. So no one is a student while they are in the cradle of passion. The passion is the driving force, okay? Hopefully that passion or that love affair that you're in has kind of created a good amount of space inside you to say, even though I don't want to do piano, the truth is I have nothing else going for me except piano. So you just sit and you hope that you'll be okay suffering for the next 2, 3, 4 hours. Okay. So usually the way pilgrims work is the following. You have a comfortable life, you know, a room you sit in, a kitchen you have, a driveway you park your car. At a certain point you have to open the door, and then you have to walk towards the place you want to go to. So the path that all pilgrims take is the path through the desert. A pilgrim is focused. You know, they're just single-minded. That's where I want to go. And all forms of advertisement around them will not tempt them. And even if they do tempt the pilgrim, and they do take exits here and there, it's filled with guilt and shame. And they catch themselves, and they regret, and they're remorseful, and they're repentant. You know, it's such a, I think, intensely religious space that the pilgrim or the seeker lives in, you know. And so the pilgrim moves because he or she has been told that this is the way you have to go. This is what you must do. As Attar, you know, said in that story, all these birds are following the hopu. They're following this other bird, and they assume that they're following this particular way towards a certain destination, and once they get there, they'll rest in peace. And so there is a way that's outward, external. You can see, you can touch, you know, you follow. There is like a disciple you follow or a teacher you follow. You know, stand to pray 5 times a day, and fast, and sit this way, and hold hands this way, and breathe this way. These are external ways that you follow, you mimic. to the letter. There comes a point where all the things that you have done leads you to a certain psychological space or spiritual space, or you have an opening. Now the way becomes inward, you know, and you're no longer following a path on the outside, but you're mostly guided through your own intuition. Okay, and when you get to wherever it is that you're going, like if my journey is towards Hussein's house, once I get there, I can't rest. And the reason is, I look at Hussein and I'm filled with emotions. I speak, I want to ask a question, but my voice begins to shake. You know, something he says, tears begin to flow down, and I'm embarrassed because Mehdad is looking at me and the other Hussein is looking at me. And these are like very, very private moments. And I don't want to share these moments with anyone. No one has the right to look at my face. And it kind of makes me think about how Nietzsche felt. That how the hell do you distract other people from invading your sacred space? You have a big mustache. Even though you're crying, they won't look at your eyes. They won't look at the tears rolling down. They just look at your mustache, you know. And so what happens after they follow the bird, I mean, that's the external way. They sit there and they're waiting and waiting. And that's another way, patience. Now you have to follow the path of patience. And the problem with patience is that it is filled with doubt. Did I do this the wrong way? Did I follow the wrong person? Did I say the wrong things? You know, and now you have to struggle. Should I stay or should I go? Was I guided by a charlatan? Was I deceived? Was I exploited? You know. And it's not that you didn't have the doubts while you were following someone, you know. But of the 1,000 birds, 33 get to follow this other bird, and they sit. And and you lose so many things. You lose your wings, and you lose your beak, and you lose your eyes, and you lose your legs, and that's what happens, And by losing these body parts means that you lose your leg. There is no place to go. I mean, the world is a big, beautiful place, but your legs can't carry you anywhere because you have no desires. You have eyes, but there is nothing out there to look at. Nothing is interesting. You have a mouth with which you can speak, but there is nothing to talk about with anyone. I mean, you lose so much as a pilgrim, And you do resent other people for laughing, for living a relatively good life. I mean, even yes?
Why do you lose so much as a pilgrim?
Why do you lose so much as a pilgrim? You're going to wake up tomorrow morning, and there's a good chance that you would want to go for a walk. There's a good chance that you want to watch some TV. There's a good chance that you want to do gymnastics. But tomorrow at 9:30, your piano teacher comes. You have to be a student of piano. And if you want to please your teacher, if you want her to be proud of you, if you want to demonstrate to her that you have practiced the past few days, what you do is you give up television, you give up cell phones, you give up walking, you just wake up at 6 in the morning, you give up sleeping, resting, and the comfort of your bed, and you sit by the piano. Because you want to become a good pianist, and because you want your teacher to like you, to be proud of you, You have to give up some things. This morning, you asked your mom to make you French toast. She was tired. But you are for her like piano. She said, should I just go back to bed? Should I clean the house? Or should I make Sophia some French toast? And because she wanted to make you happy, she became a pilgrim. She said, no rest, no shower. I'm just going to spend the next 2-3 hours in the kitchen making sure that Sophia will enjoy my food. Whenever you love something, Sophia, whenever you like something, whenever you want to be good at anything, you have no choice but to make sacrifices. That's what a pilgrim is. A pilgrim has a goal, has passion, is in love with something. And so, the birds wait and wait and wait, and they realize something really interesting. They didn't have to make the journey. And the reason was because what they were looking for was always inside them. They could have just lived in Oakland. They didn't have to go to India. And then what happens now, you have another journey. Now that this thing has opened up inside you, you become curious to see what's in it, you know. And one of the ways you discover it is, like here you're in the classroom, you know. You want to discover the nature and the quality of pain that lives inside you, and you discover it by becoming more introverted, understanding it, and then putting it into language. And that becomes your way. But I think the statement in the book is incomplete. It's incomplete because it's shrouded in mystery. And I think it's something that, I don't know, maybe she didn't understand it well, maybe it's just used as a bumper sticker. It sounds really good, you know. But once you have discovered, you know, once you've reached a destination, and once it has opened its gates, and you look at it and you experience it, what you do is you will go into the classroom and you invite your students to become pilgrims, to go on a journey. But that journey is not in the books. You ask them to go on a journey to you, inside you, to discover you, to understand you, to experience you. Because you are the way. Because you were ordinary, you became a pilgrim. Because then you followed another person. You had a teacher. You became blind, you became dumb, you became deaf, you became empty. You understood the conflicts and the contradictions. You understood pain. And you suffered. And then you sat somewhere, wondering if this was worth it. And you were patient and you struggled. You wanted to go back to life, kind of like Kierkegaard. He lives a life of pleasure. Then he says, you know what, I like to walk into the life of religiosity. He becomes religious only to realize it's not very fruitful. then he goes back to the life of pleasure, only to realize it's not worth it, you know. And so, and what you basically do for your students eventually is that you don't need to read books. You don't need to read books about depression, about conflict, about what the Bible is or this, that, or that is. I have done all of that. And you become a pilgrim towards me, not for the sake of understanding, because that's not going to happen. What you do is you just feel and you experience the feelings for a long, 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 long time until you come to a place of rest. Then by then you have felt a good amount of stuff that lives inside me. Now you can discover what lives inside me by examining your own feelings, your own thoughts, your own journey. Because every temperament, every life creates its own unique path. The only thing you can do is make someone into a pilgrim. And then that person will follow you. And because you have lived the desert life, they have no choice but to follow you in the desert. You know. And they too will have legs that will take them nowhere except your house. They will have ears that will be deaf towards everyone else except you. So that's what I think it is, and I may be off, and you know. What happened? Yeah, Ali Yusuf. Hafiz Baba. Stacy, anything?
you've talked before about your parents coming here, and also Hussein and his wife coming here. Could you talk about something related to love and sacrifice?
I think whatever kind of love that you're experiencing, while in love, any form of it, sacrifice is really, really easy. You can sacrifice your time, you can sacrifice your money, you can sacrifice your youth, you sacrifice yourself. What you have in the Old Testament and the Quran are two different kinds of sacrifices by Abraham. Of course, in the Old Testament, Abraham is asked to sacrifice Isaac, and in the Quran, Abraham is asked to sacrifice Ishmael. Abraham, originally his name is Abram, which means just a regular house, you know. He has an experience. It's a mystical experience, and then the letter H, He, is added to his name, and it means light. So all of a sudden, Abram becomes Abraham, a house of light. Okay, so you're talking about someone who has experienced love. It's not love of the body, it's not love of the places you put your body where things are advertised and emotions are generated. It's not like you watch TV, there's a movie, and all of a sudden you have a feeling of sadness or an emotion of joy, for example. So we are talking about a set of emotions that have nothing to do with society, nothing to do with your culture, nothing to do with your physical body. It is transcendental, okay? It comes from somewhere else. And it's not sacrificing your intellect, or it's not one of intellect. So what you have is, it's a house that is made up of this divine mystical experience. Now, something very interesting happens to Abraham, which is he has a son. Okay. And we all become attached to things, and Abraham is no different. What you have in the story that comes in the Old Testament is that Abraham loves God, but he also loves his son. And Jesus was right, that you can't serve two masters. It's like Junaid al-Baghdadi is carrying his son on his shoulder, and his son asks, "So, Dad, how many hearts do you have?" And Junaid says, "Well, I have one." "Do you love me?" "Yeah, son, I love you." "Do you love God?" "Yeah, I love God too." "But that doesn't make any sense, Dad." "Well, why not? How could you have one heart but love two different things? If you have one heart, you must either love God or love me. So which one do you love most?" And of course, this is the Sufi tradition. So Junaid says, "This can't be my son talking. This is like a revelation given to me through my son." Okay. And so, and all of our love, whenever you love, for any reason, it's always going to be tested. You're always going to be tempted. And the love is going to stand back and see if you're true. You know. Now, sometimes I say to myself, if this house was to burn, and if I was to want to save a couple of books, which ones would it be? Or would they be? Nothing from this room. Maybe 5 or 6 from that room, and a couple from my Persian library, and that's it. And the reason is I'm not really attached to any of this stuff. I don't find them interesting. And interestingly enough, what love usually does is that it asks for the things that you're attached to. It doesn't ask for you to sacrifice things you don't really care for, you know. So what you have in case of Abraham and Isaac is that Abraham has to sit and he has to question God's justice and God's sense of morality and compassion. Why would God ask me to do such a horrifying thing? Sacrifice my own son for what? Why does he have to be so needy? Isaac doesn't know why he needs to be sacrificed. Isaac has no clue. In the Quran, the story is slightly different. Every time Abraham is doubtful, every time Abraham says, "No, I don't want to do this," Ishmael knows exactly why he needs to be sacrificed. He encourages his father. "You know what God demands of you. You know, sacrifice me. It's okay. I know you love me, Dad." You know. And of course, what you have in both stories is that when the knife hits the jugular, an angel comes down and grabs Abraham's hand and says, "Stop it. You know, there's a lamb or a goat or a cow over there. Just go sacrifice it." The problem with sacrificing things to which you're attached is you want to know why you have to sacrifice that of all the things that live inside your life, of all the things that you don't care for. Why is it that your teacher asks for the things that you find most valuable? You know, it's like Rumi is training one of his students, he comes to realize that his student really loves his wife. And he says to him, I need to borrow your wife for like a couple of days. And it makes no sense. You know, this is Rumi, he's a religious man. And, you know, teachers are supposed to behave in a specific way. And this is not the way teachers ought to behave. And yet I love my teacher. You know, he is the light. Before Abraham, he was. Why is he asking me for such things? And so eventually he says, okay, here's my wife. And the moment that the student hands Rumi his wife, Rumi looks at him and says, take your wife back. It's okay, I don't need your wife. You were just a test, you know. Or when Shams meets Rumi, he knows that Rumi is very much attached to 3 books, but especially the book that his own father had wrote or had written. And Rumi was also very attached to praying and to also fasting. And upon meeting Shams and falling in love with Shams, Shams forbids him. He says, you can't read those books anymore, and you can't pray anymore, and you can't fast anymore. The only thing you can do is to dance, to listen to music. That's all you're permitted to do. And the other thing is, I am your book. Whatever questions you ask me and I'll try to answer them for you. Read me instead of reading books. Now, that was a very difficult thing for Rumi to do because he had been reading his father's book for like 20 years, you know. So there are, I think, a couple of stages when it comes to love and the sacrifices that it demands. Initially, the sacrifices are very, very organic, you know, and you are more than willing to become a sacrificial lamb. You know, it's like you wait by the phone for this person to call you. They said 6 o'clock and it's now 7 and then 8 and then 9 and then 10. Then you begin to doubt. Then you begin to resent. Then you begin to anger. Then you begin to just have rage inside you. And then you begin to have all these ideas in your head. Just in case the call comes, I'm not going to pick up the phone. You know. And then at 11 o'clock, I mean, you have to go through all those things, 11 o'clock, and all of a sudden the phone rings. But you're angry. But the anger gets, you know, it melts away because of the immense love you have for this person. And so you pick up the phone and you talk, and he says, I'm so sorry. He says, oh, it's not a problem at all. You know, that's what you say. There is this other stage in your love affair where love is no longer in the stage of injecting intense emotions about you. You're responsible for the thing that you love. You know, you respect it, you understand it. And you have a relatively good relationship with the object of love. Then suddenly something happens where the thing that you love demands certain things from you. And they demand the thing to which you're most attached. You know. The thing with, if you equate love with a teacher, love only desires itself to be inside you, nothing else. It only desires you to be attached to it. It doesn't want to compete with anything. It doesn't want to resent anything. And so when I suppose it comes to realize that there is something else to which you're attached, that even though love is inside you 90% of the space inside you, but you have reserved 10% for something else, it says no. I need that 10% as well. And you keep telling it, I've given you everything. Let me just have my son. You've taken my wife, you've taken my money, you've taken my house, you've taken my body, I just have a son. Just let me keep him. It says, no, I want that too. And it makes no sense. And if you're able to overcome the fear, the doubt, and I don't know how people overcome those things, you know, because we are, you know, tripart animals in the sense that, you know, you have an intellect, you have a mind, and it comes down to protect you. It doesn't want trauma to be repeated. It doesn't want more loss, more pain, more suffering. Now, it may be that what love is demanding may be very, very good and beneficial in the long run, but your mind can't see too far ahead. It's just looking at the immediate. Why am I doing this? You know, why is this being asked of me? I just remember every time that with Hussein we would say, well, I think. Hussein would say, you have no right to think about anything. But I feel. You're not mature enough to feel. Okay. You know. And it's not that you accept, you know, what he says easily. You just don't say anything back. You know. But you kind of leave somewhat resentful and angry. That, you know, I just want to like say this. And this is where I stand. He just doesn't care about those things. You know. I'm not sure which gospel it's from. I think it's the Gospel of Mark, because, you know, his students in that particular book, they're very, 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 very incompetent in the Gospel of Mark. There is a scene where Jesus is sitting and Peter can't sleep. So he goes and sits next to Jesus, and Jesus says, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to get killed over there. And Peter says, don't go. You know. And Jesus says, I don't think you understand. He says, I won't let them take you. And says, Peter, you know, you're going to deny me 3 times. And again, Peter says, no. At a certain point, Jesus looks at him and says, you're not Peter, you're in fact the devil. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, one perspective would be that what Jesus is telling Peter is, I know you love me, and I know you've become a pilgrim. You're following me from point A to point B to point C to point D. But there will come a point where I will be like Isaac, you know, where the Romans will capture me, they will try me, they will find me guilty, and they will crucify me, and you have to be okay with that. And Peter says, no, I can't be okay with that. That's too big of a sacrifice. That's too big of a detachment. You know, I want you close, I want you near. If you're going to be in harm's way, then why even go there? You know. And the point is, teachers understand, students don't. teachers know what they're asking and why they're asking. Students don't. Now this can be kind of tricky because then the assumption would be that anyone who claims to be a teacher knows exactly what he or she is doing, and students must ultimately give themselves to the teacher. And I don't think that's a good place to be. I think these days students should kind of really keep their eyes really, really open and examine and reflect and test. I think there used to be a time where teachers used to test students. I think now, because there are all these people around claiming to be teachers, it's good for students to test teachers. But to test anybody, you need to kind of have read a little bit. You must have some experiences to be able to detect, good teachers from counterfeit. But going back to your question, at the emotional stage of life, love, sacrifice is very, very easy. Cassie knows that you have a good night's sleep, you wake up, your daughter gets up, and she wants to just play around. And you have lots of energy. And you love your daughter. So you just hang out with her and you let her kind of just crap all over your life. And then 2, 3, 4, 5 hours pass by and you feel exhausted. And then your daughter says, let's go to the park. And you say, are you kidding? We were at the park for 5 hours. You want to go to another park? No, please. You still love your daughter, but your daughter has caught you at a time where you're completely exhausted. Now the question is, are you going to sacrifice some more? Or are you going to just shut her up so you can go to the bedroom and take a nap? I think Gurdjieff had this idea that, you make sacrifice, then you make super effort to make more sacrifice, but you do it consciously now. That you go for a walk and then you get tired. And then your body says, give me rest. Then you say, no, I know my body's tired and I know I am tired. But you know what? I'm going to go for another 10 minutes. And then 10 minutes pass by, you're by the house, you want to go in. And then you make another super effort. You say, no, I'm not going to give in to my body and all that. But you just don't know the outcome. My parents loved us, but that love had a good amount of fear in it. So at the age of 11, I was sent to India to study, without any parents, without any relatives, knew no one. So as parents, you sacrifice your money, your attachment to your kids. You send them somewhere. It's a shot in the dark. So it really is. It's a shot in the dark. And because we are multi-layered animals, I think at different stages, depending on the person you're working with, there are sometimes physical things you have to sacrifice, sometimes there are emotional things you have to sacrifice. That despite me rambling on and you're exhausted and you want to say, Amir, please shut up, for example, you keep those emotions and those feelings inside you, and that's a sacrifice. Sometimes you know what I'm saying doesn't make any sense. Intellectually, you're much more rational, you're much more logical, you're much more eloquent and articulate. And you hear me just talking and you say, well, that didn't make sense and this doesn't make sense. Maybe I should just correct him. And that's another kind of sacrifice. And there are also spiritual sacrifices, kind of like what you encounter with John the Baptist and Jesus. They're both very, very spiritual, but John the Baptist knows that Jesus exists at a higher spiritual plane. So he says now that Jesus is around, he needs to be more visible. And I just need to diminish. I need to become more invisible, you know. And so it's sometimes difficult to distinguish, you know. You know, Hussein is really sick right now. The one that is still alive. And every time my brother or my sister call me and say, go visit him. He was your friend for 30 years. And I say, I am willing to part with my money. If you need money, I can give you some money to give him. I'm not willing to sacrifice my time. You know, before I was willing to sacrifice my time and my money for Hussein. But now I don't. Money is fine, but not time. You know, sometimes you sacrifice your time and you give your ears to someone and they just keep pounding garbage into your ears. But you're not going to sacrifice your own position for what they're talking about. You know, but out of respect, you're just going to let them talk. You know, you don't see your teachers as human. There is something very magical about them. And being around them makes you feel magical about yourself, that you become more than just meat. That your physical and your brain chemistry, they begin to change. You know, you don't become physical. You become less meat and more spirit, you know. And so sacrificing anything becomes relatively easy. But that's only the case if you're working with someone who is 80%, let's say, working on a different plane, and 20% is down here just with the tables and chairs of physical life. What makes sacrificing difficult is when you have become a bit more human, or when you see your teacher a bit more human, then sacrifice of any kind, whether it's your time, driving from over there to here, you know, then everything becomes difficult and you have to struggle. And sometimes the struggle is too much, and sometimes you realize that the price is too much to pay and you won't do it anymore. There is this story told to us by Idris Shah that, you know, this woman goes to her husband, gives him some food, and the husband looks at her and says, "That spot in your eye, when did it come about?" And the woman looks at him and says, "You mean this spot here?" Yeah, that. "How long has it been there?" He said, "It came about the moment you stopped loving me." That when you're in love with someone, you don't see the flaws. You don't feel abused. You don't feel exploited. You do it because you want to. I mean, it comes from your soul. You want to sacrifice your entire being for this other person. But when they look at you and say, "Oh, well, what is that spot in your eye?" It means that they no longer love you the way they used to, because now they can see. And the moment they see, what exactly is it that you see? Well, you see all things that are human, filled with flaws and insufficiencies. You know, I think the three of us, Hussein, Mirdad and myself, we were very, very lucky that for a decade or so, we didn't see Hussein as human. You know, that he was 10, 15, 20% like us. He needed money, he had to eat, you know, he had to cheat and lie and do all those things to make a living. But the other 80%, he would write, he would think, he would play around with the verses of the Quran. There was just something about him that didn't much care about the things that ordinary people cared for. Then time passed. And then you begin to pay attention, you listen carefully to what he's saying, and you realize, I'm not interested. And from that point on, it's finished. You know. I think someone like Irina is very, 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 very lucky. I mean, incredibly lucky, because most of us have lives that, you know, you reach the bottom very quickly. We have friendships and companionships, relationships that don't have much depth. And even if they do, life steals them. You know, you just get involved with the politics of life and everything is ruined. You know, to work with someone for 10 years, and then to sit with the experience for another few years, and then to write a book about the experience another few years, and then to go around talking about your experience for another few years. That's a really, really good life. And even after everything is done, she comes on the stage on her videos and says, my revered guru, my revered teacher, you know. I mean, if you've paid attention to the way I speak about Hussein, you know, there are moments of profound disrespect, you know. It's like all the things he had done for me I no longer value. I imagine that, you know, it's my own doing. But when you pay attention to her language, there is this reverence that just lives inside her, and she expresses it, you know. And it's such a privilege to be able to worship someone for as long as she was able to, you know. The rest of us, we're not that lucky. I really, really, really liked Jordan Peterson when he first came onto the scene. Then he started wearing suit and tie, and then he started like wearing a bow tie and going to all these shows, and he became drunk with power, and he began to put his feet into politics and other areas where he had no expertise in, you know. He even gave himself the right to talk about Israel and Palestine. And then little by little you realize, well, even though he has good things to say, you know, you're just no longer interested, you know. There was a show on TV, I don't know if it was on Netflix or some, The Young Pope, I think, where Jude Law plays the Pope character, where he has a meeting with some people and he says that I don't want my picture on anything. I don't want people to see my face. I don't want people to know who I am. I want to be invisible. I want to be mysterious. Because as long as mystery exists, you know, people will gravitate towards that. So, Abhi, anything?
the devotion that you talk about with Irina, Amir, is that different than the way you talk about Teacher Hussein and love for him?
No, I think in some ways it's very similar. I think whenever you love something, whenever you love something, you're always in a state of prayer. You're always worshiping. You're always longing to be near it. You know, it's no longer in the stage of want, but you're in the stage of need. And whenever you're in a stage of need, there is poverty. And that poverty is desiring to be with the thing that you love. And then you journey towards it. And then you sit by it, and then you have it, and then you submit yourself to it, and you say, "Thy will be done." And whether you're in love with like a Snoop Dogg or a Jesus Christ or a Socrates or a Hussein or a Bhai Sahib, they're all the same. The only difference, I think, is you know, sometimes you fall in love with someone's looks. And if someone is physically attractive, you're going to have some feelings and emotions generated inside you. You know, and then intellectually you're going to say, okay, how can I, have them? How can I talk to them? Okay. I think the shelf life of that particular act of worship and devotion is about 3-4 weeks, and then the human elements will come in. You know, your history and his history, and the conflicts begin, and the love goes away. And all that you will try to do is you will try to damage control, because both of you, you got together because of the physical attraction. The sex is good. Going out and having food is good. Once in a while, conversation is good. But then the conflicts begin. You don't see things eye to eye. His power and your power, and eventually one person needs to be dominant in the relationship. So there's lots of conflict. Sometimes you fall in love with someone because they happen to have a very sad story. And then you fall in love with that story, and you fall in love for a specific reason. You want to help them in some shape or form. Okay? So even though they may not be physically attractive, emotionally for you they're very attractive. Okay? And so that attractiveness forces your physical body to be next to theirs. Okay? Now, one of the nice things about being attracted to someone's history and then physically they will grow on you is that emotions are complex. Emotions have complex histories, and it's like this gigantic puzzle, that you buy from Amazon for $500 because it has 50,000 pieces. And that'll keep you occupied for a long, long, long time. But then you get exhausted, you know, and you no longer care about the sadness or the story that lives inside the person because you've heard it 1,000 times, you know. And so the shelf life of that is about maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years, maybe if you're lucky. And whenever you kind of fall in love with someone for a variety of different reasons, you become future oriented. You want to live with them, you want to marry them, you want to have their children, whatever the case may be. But you realize that they're not very stable. You know, physically they don't have a job. Emotionally they go through all these mood swings, and you say, "Well, I can't. I don't want to be around this stuff all the time. You know, life is tough as it is. I want to have a companion who's a resting place, not someone who creates more chaos in my life." And after a while, you just get exhausted. Then I suppose you can fall in love with someone intellectually, you know. Someone who is intellectually attractive is very knowledgeable, you know, and they also have the ability to piece together data and information in such a nice way, and they can articulate and express it really well. So you become attracted to them. Haqi was such a person, you know. He was an amazing man. He was an MD, a PhD, an acupuncturist, all sorts of, I mean, he had so many tricks in his bag. He was an introvert, and you asked him one question, he would just go on, talking about all these facts and figures. And, I mean, very, very attractive way of explaining things. And his body language, you know, I could say he was very addictive, you know. But he lived so much in his head that his physical life was just a mess, you know. And he was just all mind. And there comes a point where you say, well, you know, Mr. Haqi, how do you apply this? You know, and he wouldn't know. And I suppose the shelf life of falling in love with someone's intellect would be longer than falling in love with someone's looks or someone's traumatic emotions, you know, or being creative. And then you can fall in love with someone's, I suppose, spirit, if there is such a thing, you know. And the shelf life for that is much, 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 much longer. I mean, look at 2,000 years ago, Jesus comes by, and to this day we keep writing books about him, you know. But I think the common denominator for all these different forms of love is that there's an element of worship, there's an element of sacrifice, there's an element of emptiness, there's an element of devotion and longing and prayer. They're all the same. It's just that you long for Brad Pitt maybe for 2 weeks before he arrives, but, you know, to love someone's intellect and to want to understand what he or she is talking about, that takes a lot more sacrifice, a lot more patience. And you yourself become much more refined because you love something that's a bit more mature, something that's a bit more evolved. But I think they're all the same, the element of devotion and sacrifice. I think all three of us. Mehrdad would not come to gatherings because, you know, he was married and few kids, but Hussein and I would. And I think we did what we could to make sure that Hussein's life is first, he's pleased with us, that if he needed help with anything, we would be there. You know. I never asked my father about some of the issues I was going through. You know, but I did ask Hussein. That someone who's not blood related, yet you have more respect for him than you have for your own father. You consider him to be more wise, more insightful than your own father. You know. But Irina was very lucky. You know, that she continuously talked about her teacher, you know, and Llewellyn wasn't. Llewellyn, who is Irina's student, he spoke of her once in a while, and then